Hello and welcome to CIS 1199. Today I'll be talking about the development process, or more specifically the stages of the development process, or the phases of the development process. All right, let's get started. So a little bit of table of contents here. First, all the phases here on the left. The concept phase, pre-production phase, prototype phase, production phase, alpha and beta, gold, and the post-production phase. Okay, those will be all the phases that I'll talk about today. And then if you stay tuned for the second half of my presentation, this is the documentation, a brief outline of the requirements for the final project that I have for you. All right, so stay tuned to the second half of this presentation. Will be in a separate video following this one. Okay, let's start with the concept phase. Okay, the concept phase, the game is not officially been done. Nothing is concrete yet. Things might be getting drawn out. It's really just the idea phase of a game. No lines of code have been drawn. Digital images may exist. Possibly lines of code have been drawn if the concept came from a programming concept. Maybe the idea of the game is to work with a cool coding feature that was discovered, then that, of course, that would exist already. But generally, this is just an idea. Hey, the game is going to be XYZ, and then we're going to start fleshing it out. If the development studio is the one fleshing it out, then there are different departments. The personnel that's in there is going to be exploring options within their own department. So a lot of design work is going to go into figuring out what kind of things work. The development folks are going to kind of figure out the broad strokes of what this is going to be. There's not really any nitty-gritty going on right here. Very broad strokes of is this a project that this development studio can handle? Is it too small for them or too big for them? That's important to know. If it's too small for a development studio, then you're not going to have enough work for the entire studio to stay busy. If it's too big, you're not going to finish it, or you're not going to finish it in time. So those are the kind of things that are going on right now in the concept phase. All the broad strokes, okay? Keep that in mind. So then next is the pre-production. It's the official version of the concept phase. So things have been, pen to paper has begun, still not officially doing any code, unless of course it's a game based on a cool feature. That's usually a smaller studio is going to do that, an indie developer or something. Concept art is officially begun now. Like we mentioned, I mentioned in a previous class, the concept art is the thing that gives everybody else in all the other departments, gives them a visual idea of something to follow in their mind. Okay, if I just tell you the boss is this big enemy with shoulder pads and a BFG, some of you are going to come up with similar ideas, but if I draw it out, the concept art will be done in this stage. If we draw it out and give it to everybody, they'll go, okay, I know exactly what that is. And they'll all be on kind of the same step. This is also the stage where the design document, for those of you that have had the game design class already, you'll be very familiar with a design document. A design document will be made during pre-production. Ideally, all the design elements will have already been fleshed out in pre-production before they're being built. If you have design issues that arise that nobody had planned for in pre-production. Once they get into production, you kind of figure out, oh, what's this thing over here that we haven't figured out yet? Well, we've already built a whole bunch of the whole underlying code, and now we're going to have to go back and change things, and hopefully we don't break it in order to put this thing in that was not properly fleshed out in the pre-production. So as much as you can possibly get done in the pre-production, in the design document, do everything possible before anything starts being made, because if you build everything and then you come back and say, we have to somehow squeeze this thing in that's supposed to be in there, but we didn't document it properly, and now you have to undo some other stuff in order to make it work. So, because ideally, the pre-production will figuratively build the entire game on pen and paper before anything is even made. Okay. Next phase is the prototype phase. Very important. And let me point out that some of these phases are going to overlap. Especially the different teams and departments in a studio. One department is going to dive in wholeheartedly into a phase, and then another department may take their work and begin to kind of overlap and get into another phase. So an example I've been mentioning a lot is a smaller game will have some sort of cool function that's been that's kind of the basis for the game. So a very much smaller game, they will have already a prototype way early on in the concept phase. Okay, the prototype will already exist way back in the concept, because that is the concept, was a prototype for whatever. Maybe somebody was joking around and having fun, or it was like the Orbs game from before, the prototype. If it was a larger studio, they were originally making that golf game, if you remember, and then there was a bug, and they redesigned the whole thing because the bug made the game even more fun. It wasn't a golf game anymore. Well, let's say it was a bigger studio and they had all these things going on, and they couldn't not deliver the golf game because they had the marketing behind the golf game, and they had commitments with XYZ company that they had to have a golf game. So they had to finish the golf game, but they left this functioning concept of, hey, here's this game that we think will be really fun, but we couldn't make it yet because we had to finish this golf game. So that could be the prototype for the next game. Way before the concept phase. It is the concept phase, like, hey, this could be really fun, we have this. It's just a very, very early prototype, and we're going to start with that. So the prototype phase could start much earlier. If not, once you get through the concept and the pre-production phase into the prototype phase, this is when maybe you start coding something, but probably you're going to start looking at software and hardware concerns, like which platform or platforms is this game going to make the most sense to actually build for? What kind of software restrictions are going to be at use there? Maybe your game uses whatever the current engine is at the time, but this current engine doesn't work universally on all platforms. So now you have to say, okay, we're going to do it inside this one platform because this is the one that our studio knows how to work with, and we're concerned about porting it out into something else. So all those kind of early issues are going to start being played out right now. And then noted, okay, in the prototype phase, the first prototype does not have to be a coded game. Okay, you can definitely, absolutely, a lot of games are made into a tabletop game first. And this is just so that the developers can have a sense of what it is that they're building. So you make some sort of tabletop game version of the game. It doesn't have to be fully fleshed out. It can be 3x5 cards, things written on them or whatnot, and you just kind of play through and you get a really good idea. You get a physical pen and paper idea of how this game plays out, where the fun is in this game, things that you would never have figured out to explore if you were just coding. Now you can, and you can go through the game and you can figure out new avenues for fun that you wouldn't have gotten if you were just typing away and building some code. Also, the visual style of the game is really going to take form now. The concept art, as you've probably seen concept art before, and you realize, hey, why doesn't the game ever look like the concept art? It's because the concept art was just to give everybody a good idea of what it is in the beginning, and then the official art is put in later. It's digitized. Edges are smoothed, whatever the case is. The drawing style comes in. The concept artist and the official artist probably aren't even the same person or the same team or even work at the same company, perhaps. So they have their own different styles, and the art can totally change, and almost always does, between the concept and the official art later on. Borderlands was somewhat famous for, they had basically finished their game and they said, yeah, we're going to redo all the art. Offhand, I don't remember what their driving force was when they did that, but they decided to redo all the art. It was much more photorealistic beforehand, and then they went for this kind of cel-shaded drawing concept afterwards. Worked out really good for them. They made some kind of campy, fun, lighthearted, blow everything up, shoot them in the face kind of game instead. Really worked out for them. Point being that the art is going to change. And then I also have here the FPL, the first playable level. In the prototype phase, the first playable level is primarily what is going to be worked on, and this is a level that is never going to play later on in the game. Nobody's going to actually play. This is the developer's level. Some of you may have seen you'd put in some kind of cheat code into a game or whatever, and you get into the developer level. That's like not a fun level, right? You just go through there, and it just has maybe a bunch of doors you can go through, and you can try and test out the different functions that are built into the game. So the first playable level is just a level that has a lot of stuff built into it. That's potentially everything that needs to be done for testing without actually building the levels and going through the level design and all that, because that comes later. So this is just a prototype for developers to go in and make sure stuff works without having to actually play the game. Imagine if you were a developer and you're working on something into, I don't know, level 7 of the game. You're like, okay, I'm working on this thing in level 7 and I need to test out if it works, but I'm actually not very good at the game, so we're all the developers are sharing a game save that's been saved at the beginning of each level or whatnot. Now I have to spend part of my day making it through different stages of level 7, whatever it is, in order to get to the area that I need to test for the thing. That's just stupid and a big waste of time. Instead, you get this first playable level. The developer can walk through whatever, doors or whatnot and say, okay, I'm testing level 7 over here. I'm testing this thing that is in level 7, and I have a copy of it put into this FPL. And then I just walk over and do it. There's no enemies for me to dodge. There's no tricks. I just go over and test that little thing, make sure that I coded it right. They're not testing, right? Because there are game testers. But a lot of people do want to build something and give it a walkthrough and go, okay, I didn't write -1 when I meant to write 1, or whatever the case is. So prototype phase, all right? Moving on to the next phase is production. All right, this is where the game is actually built, the production phase. Okay, it's going to be the second longest phase of a game or software. in general. Maintenance phase is always the longest phase, if of course you have maintenance, which we'll talk about when we get to that phase. In the production phase, the most important thing is how the timeline is managed. Obviously, the game is going to get built, and it's very important that everything works to go in there. But the timeline of how it's built, all the deliverables, this comes before this, and everything has to be done by whatever the date is before it's going to get moved on to the next phase and get ready for release and all that. And all that is super important. So the management is the most important thing during the production phase. A development team will have just finished crunch time when they're about to start production of a new game. They'll have just finished crunch time of their previous project, right? So crunch time is those last few weeks or so at the very end of a project when everything is now, and it has to be done yesterday. And they're getting as much done as possible, trying to make sure that they get in before the deadline because it's got to be made. Games already have a release date, sometimes way in advance, and you have to meet that release date. If you don't and you delay the game, fans are going to be so unconsolably sad and angry that you pushed your game back. So nobody wants to do that. So there's crunch time, and then in the beginning of the next project, you're like, oh, I can relax. We finished that one. Don't relax in the beginning. People want to, but you shouldn't, because relaxing in the beginning is leading directly to the crunch time in the end. You relax too much in the beginning. You've gone on vacation, you've taken your break, you've sat at the water cooler too long, and then all that adds up, and when it gets down to the end, you're like, oh crap, it's crunch time again. So, take a short break, but make sure it's short. Also of note during production is the iteration development cycle. Okay, so this is going to be a little clockwise circle right here. Plan, create, test. So you're going to plan, draw out, write down whatever it is that you're going to, so you can apply this to even the smallest coding function. Plan what it is, which is, write your little pseudocode, whatnot, and then create it, actually make it work, and then test it that it does work, and then keep on doing that larger and larger and larger scale. Plan, create, test. Plan, create, test. This is proven widely embraced. Makes progressive improvements in each one. It's also called fail faster because you're doing a little thing and you're testing it, and you're doing a little thing and you're testing it. And if there was going to be a failure in the grand scheme of things, you'll find it very quickly because you'll be testing very iteratively. So very popular design or development procedure is to iterate, build something, make sure you plan what you're going to build. Don't just have an idea, actually write it down. It really helps to actually write things down and then do them, because when you're in the plan phase, you're in a slightly different mindset than when you're in the create phase. So just write it down, create it, test it, move on to the next one. Write it down, create it, test it, write it down, create it, test it. Okay. Yes. Yeah. Moving to the next phase. So the major bulk of production is done, and now we're going to the alpha phase. What's the alpha phase? It's not really any different than the production phase, is it? So it's not very much different on, depending on where you are in the production environment. It may not look any different at all to you, but as I have here in bold, the first line, the alpha phase is marked when the game is technically playable from start to finish. So when you get to the alpha phase is when you can start up a game, boot it up, press start, play through, and get to the end, and you can actually do all that. And you can say, all right, if worst comes to worst, we can ship this game and it'll be absolute garbage and full of bugs, but you could get to the end and beat it. So that's the alpha phase. So all the production phase up until that point, you're building all kinds of stuff, and presumably there's various levels of how much things work and how far you can get through the game. But once you can actually say, hey, you could actually play through this whole game, now we're technically in the alpha phase. And there's a number of elements that have to be completed in order to finish the alpha phase, or in order to be in the alpha phase. So you're going to have at least one game path all the way through. Okay. The text is going to be in place in your primary language. Okay, so not all games, but a lot of games do have a secondary language in them. They've been transcribed into whatever language. Like the North American release is pretty much just going to be in English. It may have a toggle where you can switch to another language. But games are released in other countries as well, and the primary language in that country will change. Okay, so you'll have the text in one primary language anyway, presumably the primary language of the development studio. A basic interface for the game will be done, the user interface that will be completed and functional. Okay, minimally functional. It will be documented so that they can go through and use it, because it will need to be documented at least a little bit, unless it's dead simple. The team the person or team who made the interface, you're going to give that interface to somebody on the other team, and if they can't figure it out immediately without having to look at it, they're going to fall back to the documentation. They may not be working in the cubicle next to you, so they're going to need documentation to figure out how that interface works. So that's important. The game will be compatible with the primary target hardware. So you're making an Xbox game and a PlayStation game, or just one or the other will be compatible with the primary target. And even if you're making just one, let's say you're just making a game for the PlayStation 4. PlayStation 4 has been out for a few years, and they do improve on the hardware in these systems over time. Some of you may or may not be familiar with that idea, but they do improve the hardware over time. They usually never downgrade ever, because a game that's released on the first version still needs to be playable on the next version. So the later versions, generally, if they're different at all, they're different with a slight improvement in performance. But this is as technology changes, as the manufacturing process changes, so they come up with new ways to put hardware in to save themselves money. That's basically what it comes down to. There's no reason for them to change it if they're not doing it in order to save money. An older version of the Xbox had a completely rebuilt video GPU in theirs for the later ones, and this is because they, over the couple of years that it was out, they came up with a way to release a whole thing on a smaller chip, which was better for heat transfer, and because the heat transfer was better, it just performed better overall. So they changed that. The building of it was cheaper to begin with as well. If it costed more, they probably weren't going to put it out there because they weren't making that much money on console sales to begin with. But they did improve it, and this is not unusual for all the other ones, all the other platforms as well. The Switch has more than one version. Most platforms have multiple versions. The original PlayStation had quite a few versions, actually. There was earlier versions had actually RGB plugs in the back, kind of a unique one with a headphone jack right in the back of it as well. And then over the years, they changed that out for a PlayStation-specific port that they kept even through the PS2, and the PS3 still had it as well. So they do change the hardware as new technology, new manufacturing process increase. So the target hardware, whichever is the one that this game needs to function at, If a new PlayStation is released, the target hardware is still the first one. So it will be compatible with that one. And then later on, when you're not in the alpha phase, or maybe when you are, but later on somebody does have to test that. That's part of testing. You do have to test all of them, but the primary one should be all set and ready to go and compatible in the alpha phase. Minimum system requirements. This is a little bit specific to PC or a phone or something, not really a PlayStation or an Xbox, because the system requirements are pretty much all the same for that. But very much just like the target hardware for a console, the system requirements for a computer. So they're going to test the minimum, and somebody is going to have to make the decision that if a certain part of the game or the game itself doesn't work on their chosen minimum requirements, they have two options. They can fix the game so that it does work on their chosen minimum system requirements, or they can update their minimum system requirements to say, hey, we can't support that. We're going to have to raise our minimum requirements. There's two ways to go. You can either fix the code so that it works on lower requirements, or just raise your requirements. Next, physical interface test for compatibility. Make sure the controls work, keyboard and mouse, make sure all that works exactly how it's supposed to work. Okay. Pretty straightforward there. Placeholder art in place. So remember, we've talked about art a few times now with the concept art, and then the art is being rebuilt again later on. The official art in the alpha phase, at least something will be in place for every piece of art that has to go in the game. We'll have a placeholder art if there's not an official final piece of art in there yet. If it's not been developed, it's not been digitized and drawn and all that, there'll be a placeholder for it at least. Okay. If applicable, multiplayer will be tested, and if it's not working, documented what's not working and all that, but it'll be tested, and you'll know why it's not working. And again, if it's applicable, a draft of the game manual. Not all games have a manual these days. I understand that, but there'll be something. Insert sleeve will be drafted, or if you're making a tabletop game, you may have a really thick manual. There'll be a draft for that as well. Those are kind of the same thing, right? And then in the alpha phase, the development is going to kind of continue there for a while. What that means is that the general production phase has, what you think is going to be the entire production of the game, but the alpha phase is kind of going to take over, and it's going to sit there for a while in alpha phase, and all these things are going through, because, like I mentioned, once you got a game that can be played from start to finish, technically you're in alpha production now, which means that the game could be played by insider tests, okay? Insider testers for alpha testing. After alpha testing is beta testing. So remember, alpha testing, when the game could technically be played from start to finish, that is considered alpha testing. In beta testing, when the game is, quote, finished, now it's ready for beta. Okay, when you're ready to say, all right, this is like the minimum requirements to kind of show it to the public, because that's generally what beta testing has become. Not always. Beta testing doesn't necessarily mean it's open beta. Okay, it could be an internal beta. But beta testing is the game is technically finished. All the things are in place. All the things are, quote, working. Okay, there's probably still a lot of bugs, but presumably in beta testing, all the bugs are small bugs. Okay, there's no game-ending bug, literally unplayable. Okay, I have that in quotes, where that's the only type of bugs that should still be around in the beta testing, is the ones that are meme literally unplayable. And then the object of the beta test is to find and correct all the bugs that still exist, verify functionality on all the supported platforms, which is a big deal that we've been talking about for 2 phases now. If you can, there may be some places where you can fine-tune the performance of the game. That maybe there's some parts in the game where there's a lot of things going on, and it really kind of pushes the hardware of your chosen system. So maybe you can find some places to fine-tune the performance so that your game runs a little bit smoother. Okay, because the smoother your game runs, the more polished it looks, the more people like it, and the more they're going to tell their friends. And then also in here, in the beta phase, you'll verify, well, somebody, whoever job it is, will be verifying the language content. So in the alpha phase, we tested, we made sure that the primary language was in place. That doesn't mean that it's not got any typos anywhere, and it doesn't mean that there wasn't some placeholder text boxes in there somewhere. So in the beta phase, all the text ideally should be gone back through and made sure that there's no typos and there's no mistakes in there. There's no placeholder text, no filler text that was put in there and somehow slipped by. Accidents are going to happen, but go through all the text. At the end of the beta phase, we have gold. The game is done. Ship it. Okay, the game is finished. Pack up your keyboards and go home. It's all done, right? No. A master copy of the game is going to be made, sent off to wherever your game is actually produced, because now it has to get actually stamped onto discs and shipped out across the country or the world or wherever it is that your game is releasing to. In the meantime, internally, the development is going to be working on whatever they're going to be working on next, which is, so gold is very, very short time says, hey, we're done, ship it. And then we go to post-production immediately. As soon as the game is done, basically the next day probably, there's going to be at least a handful of people working on the next stuff, or they've never even stopped working. They've said, okay, here's all the bugs that we're going to fix, and we're going to release it, and I still have a list of bugs probably. So post-production, the maintenance phase of development, is the longest phase of development for any piece of software. Very few pieces of software are going to ship it and never touch it again. Very few. If there's any kind of support, if there's any kind of maintenance at the end, it's going to be the longest phase, because you've spent a year making it and you're going to spend 5 years maintaining it, making sure that it works with new technology or new things. Somebody found a bug that you've never tested around, you've never gone through, because now that it's been out for 5 years, 10 million people have played it, and somebody finally found this bug, and you're going to fix it because you're fixing bugs. So what are the different things that are going to happen in post-production? Patches, updates, expansions, and DLC are kind of the same. So the difference between patches and updates: patches are very small, kind of immediate bug fixes that are noticed. Maybe balancing online play as well. There's not going to be big things in patches. Patches are mostly going to be not in-your-face visible things. And of course, the core players are going to notice it right away. But the patches are going to be much smaller things. So bug fixes, game balancing, potentially new content. Like I know a lot of online games these days, especially mobile games, they have patches, planned patches every week, weekly patches, and they release little snips, little weekly contents on there. Not necessarily updates, because they do big ones every 6 months or so. They'll do a really big one with major changes. So the updates are going to be big changes. Large-scale performance tweaks, new modes, new levels in the game. That's going to be the updates. Potentially complete overhauls are going to fit into the updates, and then patches are going to be much, much smaller things. So all the small things. Something gets nerfed because it was too OP to begin with, or something gets made kind of OP because it was crap to begin with and nobody liked it. That's all the patches. And then updates are all the big stuff. And then expansions and DLC are kind of that's the same. They were called expansions years ago. Now they're called DLC because the internet is fast enough that we can actually download a gigabyte worth of content in a reasonable amount of time. Most of us can. If you, depending on where you're at, you may even have access to fiber internet speeds, and you can download a gigabyte worth of content in 20 minutes or less. That must be nice. But most of us is still going to take an hour or more to download a gigabyte, but that's not unreasonable. You can just say, hey, download this when I'm not actually playing the game, and then a couple hours later, I get this extra DLC. It wasn't always like that in the past. You actually had to buy these expansions in physical store and then install them. In either case, they function the same. They're episodic or totally new content in the game, almost like a sequel, but built into the original. Season passes fit in here. A lot of games have season passes where there's all kinds of new content. Borderlands is a favorite of mine that had a season pass for both of its, a couple of its, probably all of them. I didn't play all of them myself, but the season pass in a couple of the DLC actually had more playable content than the main game in terms of time, not necessarily in terms of game coding or space or whatnot. But this is, the game has been made, and they say, okay, we can make some more money if we keep our level designers working, and then everybody else just works on bugs and that, but we can design a whole heck of a lot more levels, and then we can basically sell a whole nother game, but you didn't have to keep the designers in and all the developers, and you only have to have the level designers and a handful of other select folks as well. You may need new designers. Yeah, you're going to need new designers because you have to design new bad guys and all that. But the vast majority of your game is already made. Now you're just adding new stuff on top of it. So with a skeleton crew, you're going to make all this new content. You can keep your game alive and you keep making money for a few years before folks move on. So DLC is hugely popular because the return on investment is right there. With half a crew or less, you can make some DLC and double your money, maybe. So that's the phases. Real short recap of all the phases. The concept phase, the game is not quite official yet. It's still just kind of pen and paper idea phase, maybe a couple of drawings. We kind of figured out where it is. We have the high concept of things. That's why it's called the concept phase. Pre-production, the game is officially started. The design document should be being built in this phase, okay? Because the later you wait to finish the design document, the more problems you're going to have. Moving on to the prototype phase, where every level, every function of the game, you're going to have the first playable level. You may already have an early prototype of the game to test on playability, make sure that the big name things in the game actually work the way they're supposed to work. That moves into Of note in the prototype phase of the game, of game development, is any of the code that's made in there does not necessarily have to make it into production at all. You can totally, you build any number of prototypes that you want, and when you get to the production phase, you can start fresh. Maybe you copy and paste certain pieces from the prototype in, but it's actually pretty useful to start fresh on the production as well. Alpha phase is when you have a game that's technically playable from start to finish. Okay, then you're not in general production anymore. You're in alpha production. You could play the game from beginning to end. Beta phase is when the game is, quote, finished. Okay, if your boss told you to right now, you could release it in beta. It may not be the best, but it works. Gold is when you fixed all the bugs that you're going to fix before you ship it and ship it. Post-production is going to be patches, updates, DLC, all that stuff. Ideally, the post-production phase is going to last a long time. You're going to keep your game running for a couple of years at least and bring in all those customers and all that money. Okay. Break. Okay. Stay tuned. Come back for part 2 of this week's presentation when I talk about the design document, or not a design document, of your final project document to make. Okay, so have a quick look at that as I sign off and get ready to make my second video for you. All right.